Francis Chadwick has something new on her mind. She's a world-class swimmer. And of late, she's been thinking about attempting to do what no woman has ever done. She's already successfully swam the English Channel, but now she puts forth this notion of swimming from the Catalina Island to the California mainland. So on July 4th, 1952, with a number of boats surrounding her, she enters the frigid waters. Mile after mile, she swims. Hour by hour, she swims. It's a foggy day, but the fog does not cause her to give in. She continues to swim. Night sets in, and it is so dark that she cannot see her hand and her face, but she keeps on stroking. But then what no one predicts happens. After 15 hours and 55 minutes, she waves to the boats and she says, "I quit." Things don't always end the way they began, do they? For instance, you save money for a down payment on a house, but then you end up using it to pay a major repair on the car. Or you start college. The first 2 semesters fly by like lightning. But you cannot return the 3rd semester because you have to return to work full time. Things don't always end the way they began. And then it is even possible for us to begin well devotionally with walking with God, serving God, being in ministry with God, but somewhere along the way we fall by the wayside. It happens. In fact, we see it in Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 13 through 18. After some 6 hours of hearing the word read, listening to the interpretation of the word, you would think that much time standing around listening to the word, that the people would have had enough of the word. But on the 2nd day, fathers, heads of households, priests, and Levites return to hear more reading. And as Ezra begins to delve deep into portions of Leviticus, he, along with the people, are astonished by what they discover. They discover that there is distance between what the word required of the people and how the people chose not to respond to the word. Some years ago, to that generation, God commanded that they would observe the Feast of the Booths to commemorate and even celebrate how he had delivered them from Egypt and how he had provided for them for 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness. That was the previous generation. So what about this new generation? What would they do? They have read the law of God. They've interpreted the word of God, and now they must choose to apply the law of God. The same is true of us. Previous generations have read the word, they've interpreted the word, and they made a decision to do something with the word. And now it has become our lot. We've read the word. We've interpreted the word. But unless we apply the word, we will not experience all that God has in store for his people. And so this message, as you recall, this is part 3. In Nehemiah chapter 8, where we initially hear them reading the law of God. And then they would need assistance in understanding the law of God. And now they must make the choice to not only be hearers of the word, but to what? Be what? Doers of the word. And this sermon is designed to inspire us to apply the word. We've experienced the reading, we experienced the interpreting, and now we have a choice to make. And that is in the area of application. You heard it earlier, but notice in verses 14 through 16, we hear the requirement of application. They have heard this word, they understand it, and now they are given a charge that if you're going to experience all that God has in store for you, don't worry about the previous generation. Now it is your charge, your moment. It is a requirement. Yes, after we read, after we interpret, it is a requirement, however, to do something with that word. And so they are told to go. This go speaks of endurance. They are to go and to publish this word. They are to go and proclaim this word. It reminds us, does it not, of the Great Commission, where he has taught these disciples. They have witnessed miracle after miracle. He has shared with them that he is leaving, he is going off the scene. And since he has been with them, they now have a responsibility. They have a requirement. And that requirement is not to keep the word you've heard to yourself, but to take it and run with it. We hear Jesus again. He says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And he appoints 72 disciples, and he sends them out to every town ahead of him, towns that he would ultimately visit. And he says to them, I'm sending you as sheep among wolves. wolves. That's the danger. But then he also says, do not take a knapsack, do not take money, do not take sandals. That's the difficulty of it. And what Jesus was saying then is what he is saying now. If you are going to go for God, it's going to cost you. One of the things it's going to cost you is endurance. But then not only does Nehemiah or Ezra tell the people to go, that speaks of the endurance, but then he tells them to gather. He says, bring. That means to gather. Go, it speaks of endurance, but gather speaks of expenses. He tells them to go and gather branches of olives. Branches of olive. Now this, he is not telling them to gather branches of another type of tree. He's telling them to gather branches of olive, which means they're going to have to maintain their focus, because from the outside, the olive tree looks like other trees. But specifically, the law of God says that they are to get branch of olives. But then when you find the branch of olive, when you find that tree, it's going to require fortitude, because you have to literally vigorously shake the tree so that the olives would fall, and then you've got to crush them. But then he goes on and he says you've got to find myrtle, specific myrtle. Remember that the people would be housed in these huts or these temporary dwellings for many days. And it is said that myrtle possessed chemicals that would ward off fungus and the swelling of certain body parts, which means that if they were to be well while they were observing this festival, then they needed to do exactly as they were told. But then he goes on, he says they have to get a certain type of leaf, and that is the palm. It is a fan-shaped leaf that had to be large enough to cover every booth or every hut. The going speaks of endurance. These are the requirements. The gathering speaks of expense, but this ground that they are to cover speaks of energy, because when you stay with the passage, it says that not only do they have to build a booth for themselves, it also says they have to build a booth in the courts of the house of God. They also have to build these huts in the square of the water gate, and they have to build these huts in the square at the gate of Ephraim. They've got to build all of these huts. And if they are going to experience what previous generations missed out on, it's going to cost them. These are the requirements of application. It's going to cost you to apply what you have heard and what has been explained to you. It reminds me of Kenitra Houston Dickens. She had major surgery on her knee. And she noticed the strength in that particular leg had diminished. The doctor told her to participate in a couple of weeks of therapy, and she did. But she noticed that leg buckled, however, when she attempted to walk on it. And so now she's frustrated, she's worried, she's unsure if she would regain total strength of that leg. So in a follow-up, a doctor asked her, has she been participating in any exercises? He says, now, if you're going to have full use of this leg, it's going to cost you. He said, not only do you have to do just general exercising, but you're going to have to do extra exercising. Because if you want to experience all you can as it relates to a recovery of this injury, it's going to cost you. And so it is with these people when it comes to applying, observing this particular new festival. The same is true of you. The same is true of me. Application will cost you. Sometimes it'll cost you time. You got to sit down and you've got to hear what the Spirit is saying about an opportunity to put to work the word that you have heard. Sometimes it'll cost you your treasure. God may tell you to do something tangibly as part of the application of the word that you've heard. It can even cost you talent. God may be calling you to use the abilities that he has given to you, given to me, that will flesh out this word. Well, again, there are requirements of application. It tells them to go and to gather and to build all of these huts. But then there's a second note concerning application. It's not the feast of the boost or the feast that is in and of itself, but that is different. But it is the manner in which it is to be celebrated. Remember, previous generations chose not to. But now this new assembly, they choose to apply. Since it has been written in the word, since it has been explained to them, this generation, this assembly chooses not to be like the former generation. Remember, he says, and all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity, that's verse 17, made booths and lived in the booths. For from the days of Joshua the son of Nun to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. This generation knew nothing about being in Egypt. This generation knew nothing about going through the Red Sea. This generation knew nothing about being in the wilderness for 40 years. This generation know nothing about, again, the Red Sea and the wilderness and Joshua and going around the walls of Jericho. That was not their experience. This is a new assembly. Yet they have this opportunity for a fresh appreciation for the very presence of God. It's a similar situation, but it's not the same situation. The reason that previous generation was in Egypt was because of disobedience. This generation have been in exile because of what? Disobedience. And so here you have a similar situation, but it's not the same situation, but yet they have the same God who always has the same standard. And that standard is to apply the word that you have heard. Reading the law of God is good. Interpreting the law of God is good. But what about application? What about applying the word? that we have heard. God never lowers his standards. You know, maybe you like me, maybe you're not, but I've noticed that before I go to the dentist, I brush my teeth a little longer. I mean, I put a little bit more effort into it. I brush a little longer. I scrub a little longer. I floss, a little longer. And I don't know if, going to see the dentist, I'm a bit more health conscious, or I don't know if I'm trying to impress him. But the problem with that is that the dentist looks closer and he looks deeper. The dentist he takes x-rays, and the dentist has sharp tools where they're able to dig between the teeth and get stuff up that we didn't know what was there. And the same is true when it comes to God. Every generation has some stuff in the gums that we didn't know. But when God examines us, when God speaks to us, he has the same standard. And his instructions are always the same. One generation chose not to follow his instructions. Here is a generation that has an opportunity to follow his instruction. The same instruction for that generation, God gives to this generation because his standard remain the same. Don't you love that God never changes? You don't have to ever worry about where he's coming from. And his standards never change. He never lowers his standards. But you know what he's always doing? Come closer. He's always giving us an opportunity to come closer. He's always providing us another chance to experience the blessings that accompany belonging to God. These are the requirements of application. But then, we've just heard about the relevancy of application, because now this generation, they get a chance to experience what the previous generation forfeited. This is a Rhema moment for this church. There are other generations that have gone on before you, and they experience God. You, however, have a wonderful opportunity to experience God in fresh, new, amazing ways. God never has to repeat himself, but he can manifest his glory and his presence in ways we never imagined. But it's going to cost us. We apply the word we've heard. We apply the teaching we've heard. We apply the training we have received. And then we have this opportunity to make it fit in this day and time. Again, this feast, it was not new in terms of it being different. No, God had already told them, do it, but they stopped doing it. But it was new for these people because now they get a fresh start. But then we'll ask if there's one more area. And this speaks of application. And hopefully we'll be inspired to not just be hearers of this word, but doers of it. I mean, think about it. Why waste hours and hours of hearing the word and then throw it away by not doing it? I mean, why get up out of our warm, comfortable beds, make our way to the house of prayer on Wednesday and on Sunday and get a word and then choose not to do anything with the word we have heard? And then lastly, as it relates to application, yes, is a requirement. God tells us to do it. He said, as it was written. Then the relevancy of it. The previous generation didn't do it, but now this generation can do it. But then there is even the recovery of application. Because look at what happens when they do it. And there was great rejoicing. Wow. The other generation chose not to do it, so there was nothing to rejoice about. This generation chooses to do it, and there is great rejoicing. Here is the connection. The joy that this new assembly experiences is connected to their obedience. How do you feel when you obey God? Isn't it a wonderful feeling? I mean, it's greater than a feeling, but it definitely is a feeling. Don't you feel at ease when you obey God? I mean, isn't that a sense of contentment when you obey God? I mean, even when it comes to giving, I mean, you have bills, but you go ahead and obey him. And he said, now I've done what I was supposed to do, God. Now God, let me see you show up and show out, God. Obedience there, it brings about a sense of joy. It was the NCAA cross-country championship. It was in Riversdale, California. And 123 of the 128 runners missed a turn. But Mike Del Vaco stayed on the course. And as he was running, he tried to wave the others to follow him, but they laughed at him. And once he completed the 10,000 meter race, they was asked, what did the others do, or what did they say to you when you tried to get them to go the right way, to do the right thing? He says, they laughed at me. But isn't it amazing that when you obey God, you get the last laugh? People may look at you strange when you obey God. They will say it don't take all of that to obey God. God knows your heart. But I know there's somebody else in this room besides me. There's a good feeling when you do what God tells you to do. When you flesh out the call that God has on your life, when you go where God is sending you, when you do what God has gifted you to do, you have the last laugh. And these people, there is great rejoicing because joy brings about. It comes from, rather, obedience to God. So this word here, this obedience in the Hebrew, it is Shema. It speaks of taking action. It speaks of responding to a call, regardless of the place, the time, or the situation. And God has called us to respond in obedience, no matter the time, no matter the circumstances, no matter what everybody else is doing or not doing. You see the recovery of application? The other generations didn't do it. Hadn't been done since the day of Joshua. But Joshua, they gone. Moses, they're gone. It's a new day. And now they enjoy the joy of the Lord. And it comes with obedience. You know, sometimes I've discovered in my own walk that sometimes what I've been praying for, I should have been obeying for. Let me say that one more time so you can get it. Sometimes my prayer list wouldn't be so long if I would just simply obey instead of pray for it. Because when you obey God, God has committed himself to respond to our obedience. You do what he tells you to do, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. God has committed himself to respond to you in your time of your need. I've been young, but now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging what? Bread. And so they obey. And notice the ongoing of their obedience. And day by day. They just didn't do it because they were feeling churchy. They just didn't do it because they was around everybody else. And day by day. You see that? Verse 18. From the first day, what? To the last day, he read from the book of the law of God. And what did they do? They kept the feast 7 days. On the 8th day, there was a solemn assembly according to the rule. Every generation, every church, every community, every family, every person can have a new experience. It's July 1st, 1932, which will be New Year's Day. And UCLA is playing Georgia Tech in the Rose Bowl. Roy Regal recovers a fumble. He plays for UCLA. And in his excitement, he is disoriented. And he runs 62 yards in the wrong direction. About to score for the opposing team. His teammate runs him down, tackles him at the 5-yard line. UCLA, they attempt to kick a punt, but Georgia Tech blocks it. They score safety. Now it's halftime. UCLA, their head lowered, they're moping. They head off the field to the locker room. When they get in the locker room, most of the players are sitting on the bench. Some are sitting right there on the floor, but not Roy Regal. Roy Regal is over in the corner by himself with his hand in his head. Normally during halftime, Coach Price would make a fiery, strategic speech about what was next and all of that. Not today. Total silence in the locker room. A few minutes before they were to return, he gets the players' attention and he says, men, the same people who started the first half will start the second half. All the players get up, they get their gear, they head out of the locker room to the field, everyone but Roy Regal. He is still over in the corner by himself, face in his hands. And coach says, Roy, didn't you hear me? Everyone who started the first half is going to start the second half. And he looked up with wet cheeks. Coach, I cannot do it. I've embarrassed you. I've embarrassed the university. I cannot face the fans. He walks over to Roy and he puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, Roy, the game is only half over. And Roy gets up and he goes back out because now he understands that he has another chance. Aren't you glad that we serve a God who allows you to make U-turns? Aren't you excited that we serve a God who will give you a do-over? Aren't you grateful that you serve a God who will give you chance after chance after chance? He's not a God of a second chance. He's a God of a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And God has given this church another chance.